I'll make some more for us.
Have any questions about anything thus far?
I think I have one. When you're talking about qualitative and discrete and continuous, what is quantitative connected to? Can quantitative be?
Quantitative can be either discrete or continuous.
Can't they both?
Qualitative, I don't think can be continuous.
I was going to say, I think qualitative.
Yeah, qualitative.
That's
I
like
can't think of an example where qualitative can be continuous.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's like, how do you feel?
Okay. That's it. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, and even if Savannah had a question, how could qualitative be continuous? By converting it to ratio data. Remember, I talked in human factors. I talked about the visual analog scale. Okay, well, there's a visual analog scale. Okay, it's 10 centimeters. This is too long, but the standard visual analog scale is 10 centimeters. Let's talk about your question. How do you feel where this is the worst possible you could feel physically or however, and this is the best possible? Okay. What you ask people to do is put a stroke on the scale as to how they feel. Okay, I feel about, I'm putting about there. Somebody else comes along, oh, I don't feel so good today, so I put a stroke about there. That's supposed to avoid the biases of a Likert scale. Okay. Then how do you reduce the data? Well, you measure from this end. Okay, say this is 3 centimeters, this is 7.1 centimeters. It converts it automatically to ratio data. So now it's continuous, it's quantitative, and it's ratio. It's the best possible data you can have. So you take the qualitative assessment and you convert it into something that you can use more effectively. The trouble is, it's hard to reduce these types of data. It's hard to reduce it because you have to sit and measure it. It would be easy to write a program for it, but we're so unaccustomed to that. This is what we're accustomed to. Okay? So everybody has programs for Likert scales, but nobody has a program for a visual analog scale, which I think is preferable. But as a culture, we're not used to this, so you don't encounter it very often. Okay. All right. I kind of talked about miasma and the idea that it has to do with the air vapors that cause disease and cause conditions. Germ theory was the competing idea at the time. We're talking mid-19th century now. And that microorganisms, even though they couldn't really identify what they were, the germ theory was that there were microorganisms that caused disease. And it resulted in what was called the Henley-Koch postulates. Henley-Koch postulates, even though they were dated from 1877, even though they are limited, they are nevertheless true. It's just that they don't have much utility anymore because they're too simple. Okay. And this, I'm not going to read them to you, but this is the idea that there are agents, and agents have sort of a one-to-one correspondence. Now we don't believe that there's necessarily a one-to-one correspondence. It's more complex than that, and we call those multifactorial models. And I'll talk a little bit about multifactorial models. And so, because of that, they're a bit of an oversimplification, and we don't use them anymore. Doesn't mean that they weren't an important historical development towards modern thinking. And when I'm talking about causation, try to expand it beyond necessarily just biological causation, disease and that sort of thing, because most of the causal thinking that I'll be talking about for the rest of the class today is applicable beyond that, even though it tends to have been developed in the medical field. It's not just applicable to medicine. Okay? So this is multi-causality, webs of causation. are sort of more modern thinking. Remember I said Rothman and Greenland are not the best writers? Think about this. This is their definition. The cause of a disease event is a condition characteristic that preceded the disease event, and without which the disease event either would not have occurred at all or would not have occurred until some later time. Right? Now that doesn't make sense, but you just kind of have to unravel their writing. That's the way they express themselves all the time. Indirect, and we have causal pathways. They're either direct or indirect, and that's self-explanatory. A causes B, or A causes B only because of something intermediary. Right? So that's direct and indirect causation. This is a simple web or multi-causality chart. It's a relationship among maternal weight gain, birth weight, and smoking. Okay? Someone smokes, it's going to have an effect on maternal weight gain. It will therefore be an intermediate effect in birth weight. Okay? Because maternal weight gain is directly related to birth weight. Okay? So if you have this intermediate effect, it's going to reduce maternal weight gain and thereby negatively affect birth weight. Okay? This is a fairly simple one, and I'll bring this up again when we talk about error, because this is an important relationship here. This is a really complex one. Obviously, I am never going to ask you to reproduce this, okay? But this is typical of relationships among different dietary and environmental and hereditary factors and different types of heart conditions and circulatory conditions. So you can see that we have these dietary and environmental and hereditary things that influence each other. Hyperlipidemia being just too much fat, basically, and that's affected by diet, stress hormones, smoking, physical activity, heredity. All of that influences the amount of fat in our system, which influences atherosclerosis, which has a questionable relationship to hypertension, and then each atherosclerosis has a relationship with a number of different cardiovascular diseases. Now, like I said, the substance of this is far less important than to convey the idea of when you map out all of the environmental and hereditary conditions that influence, it can be fairly complex, the relationship amongst those, and even the relationship amongst pathological conditions. Right? They will affect each other. This is a more contemporary approach to causation, is that there's a complex interplay among a whole variety of factors. Okay? If we were to apply this to something like carpal tunnel syndrome, as an example. Okay? Carpal tunnel syndrome is a neurovascular condition. Everybody's heard of carpal tunnel syndrome. But it's a neurovascular condition that has a relationship among gender, level of activity, body weight, stress, and it's a fairly complex interplay of a variety of heredity, body size, that is very similar to this. And that's why it's so hard to demonstrate that carpal tunnel syndrome is occupationally related. Okay, someone may or may not be able to get workman's compensation for it because of the variety of other factors that influence the condition itself, okay, even including hereditary ones. So just keep in mind that there's that a simple causal chain is probably never going to be the explanation. Okay, you never say A causes B, and sometimes this intermediate, and that's it, period. Okay, it's never just carpal tunnel syndrome is related to too many repetitions at your workplace. It's usually more than just that. So just keep that in mind when we're talking about this. All right, let's talk about Hill's postulates. Hill has 9 postulates, and I have all 9 of them here. I encourage you to read Hill's article. He talks about these in a lot of detail. I'm going to go over them, not in a great amount of detail, but I'll go over them one at a time. The first postulate, and by the way, and I'll say this at the end, but Hill stresses, and he's very adamant, that these postulates are not a checklist. He said, if you meet every one of my 9 postulates, my 9 criteria, that doesn't mean that you have established causation. It means that you have established that there is a likelihood of causation. Okay? And he calls it that they are not the sine qua non. Anybody take Latin? Besides me? Sine qua non is Latin for without which nothing. And it means that they are not a set of criteria that you have to meet in order to have established causation. Okay? And he's, like I said, he's very adamant about that. What he suggests, rather, is that these are guidelines that you should consider. And when you don't meet a number of these, it's more of a negative establishment. If you don't meet these, then you really have to question your causation. But if you do meet them, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have established causation. You all understand the distinction between the two? And that's an important distinction, I think. First one is strength of association. That just refers to statistical significance. When we do a test, a statistical test, we have established that there is a statistically significant relationship between 2 factors, or between a factor and an outcome. As you know, as you should have picked up in statistics thus far, statistical significance is not a certainty for a relationship. Correlation does not imply causation. That's what this includes. So what's the famous one? Increase in birth rate and is positively correlated with increase in iron exports. Okay? Probably, or increase in birth rate. I'm sorry, not birth weight. Birth rate is associated with increase in iron exports in the U.S. Okay? Well, there's probably some intermediate factors there. Let's put it that way. But it might have something to do with prosperity and that sort of thing. But nevertheless, that's not a direct causal relationship. But nevertheless, it's a positive correlation. Okay? That's essentially what he says here. Is that this will establish a weak or a strong association, but not necessarily causation. And that's what the strength of association. Consistency. If we repeat the study, which is the landmark of science, is repeatability. That implies a more likelihood of causation. However, if it's not repeatable, that doesn't mean that it's not causal. Again, it's just something to consider. These are guidelines to consider in your studies. Single cause for a single effect is what he called specificity. Since his writing, because he wrote in 1965, is when he wrote his postulates. That's when the article from the Royal Journal was published, or when it was his address. It's an article published from an address to the Royal Society. They've suggested, Rotten and Greenland particularly have suggested that that's misleading because it applies single cause, single effect. And the example they use is lung cancer. Okay? Smoking causes lung cancer, but it causes a lot of other problems as well. And it doesn't necessarily cause lung cancer either. Everybody has, a great Aunt Bertha who lived to be 99 and smoked 10 packs of cigarettes a day, or whatever. There's always somebody like that that's an exception. But that one has been criticized to a certain extent because a single cause with a single disease is probably too simple. Okay? However, it's important to establish a chain of relationship. Temporality. Why he had to say this is beyond me, but he felt compelled to say it. The cause has to happen before the result. That's all that means. Okay, you can't, and however, I don't mean to make light of it, because in one of our types of studies that we'll be looking at, which is a cross-sectional case control, it is sometimes problematic to determine whether your risk factor preceded the condition. So that's one of the problems associated with using that approach. Okay? So always be sure that your cause precedes your effect. Biological gradient has to do with dose. The more of it you get, the worse it affects you. Sometimes it's a binary relationship. Okay? Either you're infected with something or you're not. But other times, with some chemical exposures, for instance, you can, the more you're exposed, the worse the effect of it. There's a gradient. Biological plausibility. In other words, is there a mechanism that we can demonstrate where this cause can be shown to have a biological effect? Or some cause can be shown to have a biological effect, if we're talking about biology, and he is, because he's speaking from the point of view of the medical community. But once again, we can translate these into other things. You know, is it a plausible effect? This one, coherence is very closely related to biological plausibility. Does the association violate any relationships that we know? So the example that he uses is smoking causes damaged bronchial epithelium. We know that happens, and so that damage to the bronchial epithelium is consistent with the relationship between smoking and lung cancer. Like I said, it's very closely related to biological plausibility because this is a biological causal chain, put it that way. Okay. So those are 7 Hill's postulates. Last 2, experiment is their experimental support, laboratory experimental support, and analogy. Okay, analogy, because when we say A is like B, we're using an analogy. It's used in literature. That's one of the things that when you take English composition, it's the hardest to understand what's the difference between analogy, metaphor, and simile. And nobody ever figures it out. But biologically, analogy is that if drug A has this effect on, has a given effect, and it causes congenital anomalies, then another drug of the same class is likely to cause the same congenital anomalies. Thalidomide, that way back in the 50s. Thalidomide was used, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't remember this, it was used as a relaxant.
I thought it was like for morning sickness.
Yes, it was some palliative for the effects of pregnancy. Yeah. Okay, and that class of drugs then have been outlawed because it caused huge birth defects in the 50s and 60s. So they don't use that for that purpose anymore. So the analogy would be anything of the same drug class as thalidomide is probably going to have the same effect and cause birth defects. Okay, so those are Hill's 9 postulates, not criteria. I kind of already gave this. And this is the sine qua non. That's a quote from Hill. It's not a sine qua non, it's not a series of criteria. It's a set of guidelines. And point out again, tests of statistical significance cannot establish cause and effect. The old correlation does not imply causation necessarily. Now, let's finally get into some philosophy and logic. Because Aristotle talked about necessity and sufficiency. So again, I'm going to try to supplement this with a chart and see how successful it is. Okay. Necessity and sufficiency. Sufficiency. Okay. So if something is necessary, it has to be present for a condition to be relevant. Okay, so let's take our first example. A female organism for most mammals, and there are some unusual exceptions to this in the animal kingdom, but for most mammals, is a necessary cause for pregnancy. Okay, must be a female organism. So we'll say female pregnancy. It's necessary. Inhalation of silica dust. So silica dust is necessary for silicosis. Okay. For now, we'll just say those are both necessary conditions. Okay. Necessary and sufficient is somewhat different. So necessary and sufficient, without the factor, condition never develops. With the factor, the condition is always present. Okay, we can probably say that for this. So these are necessary and sufficient as well. And we have more necessary and sufficient examples here. And this is Tay-Sachs. Okay, Tay-Sachs is a genetic condition. And you have to have the genetic makeup to develop Tay-Sachs. So I'll say genetic condition and Tay-Sachs disease. Necessary and sufficient. And with it, the condition never develops, or without it, it never develops. So let's take a look at this. Genetic condition, Tay-Sachs will never develop. When you have the genetic condition, it always develops. That's necessary and sufficient. I probably should take that away from here, because female does not always produce result in pregnancy. Silica dust does not always result in silicosis. So it's necessary, but it's not necessary, but it's not sufficient. It doesn't always result. Okay, with me so far? Sufficient, and this applies sufficient but not necessary, is you have the condition, but other factors can also cause it. So it's sufficient, but it's not necessary. And my favorite example there is decapitation. Okay? Decapitation and death. Okay? Decapitation will always cause death, but there's other things that can cause death other than decapitation. Okay? So that means that it's sufficient, but it's not necessary. Okay? This is according to Aristotle's definitions of causation for sufficiency and necessity. Okay? So you have to distinguish about whether it's sufficient to cause death, but it's not necessary. Okay, decapitation always results in death, but strangulation can result in death too. So that means that it's not necessary. I don't have to be decapitated to die. I do, however, have to have the genetic makeup to have Tay-Sachs, and I always develop Tay-Sachs when I have the genetic attribute. I have to have silica to develop silicosis, but I don't always get silicosis from silica, so therefore it's not sufficient. And I have to be female to become pregnant, but pregnancy is not an inevitable outcome of being female. Okay, does that make sense so far? Okay. So that's necessary and sufficiency, and like I said, this implies sufficient but not necessary. That's an implication to it. Same thing. And then we have necessary but not sufficient, which would be like these. But another example is HIV. HIV infection is necessary to develop AIDS. Right? Okay. So it's necessary, but it's not sufficient because you can be HIV positive and never develop AIDS. Okay. So it's not sufficient to develop AIDS. And then this is kind of an esoteric one. I probably wouldn't put that there, but it's the tuberculosis is the same thing. The tuberculosis bacteria. So far, so good.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the idea of causality from the perspective of necessity and sufficiency. And we talk about this a lot, but we tend to use necessity and sufficiency in a little bit of a sloppy way, generally speaking. This is the strict Aristotelian logic approach to necessity and sufficiency. And if you do a Google search on this, you will run across some logic sites which are highly symbolic. They're very mathematical in their approach to this. I didn't think that was the best way to do this. I think this is a better, more intuitive approach to necessity and sufficiency. But if you're interested, do it. You'll run into some unusual websites, let's put it that way. Mostly from university logic departments. Okay. Oh, and then neither necessary nor sufficient, and that is lung cancer. Okay. Cigarette smoking. Okay. Cigarette smoking and lung cancer are an association, but they're neither necessary nor sufficient. You can develop lung cancer from something other than smoking, and if you smoke, you don't necessarily develop lung cancer. So smoking and lung cancer is neither necessary nor sufficient. Questions on anything? Okay. Oh,
So from an expert business standpoint, right, which of these guides you in making decisions, right? Necessity or sufficiency, a combination of both?
It has to be a combination because it depends on the situation. It's not necessarily what guides you, it's identifying whether a causal relationship is necessary or sufficient, both or neither. It's the identification of it that's more important than relying on one or the other. So, for instance, each one of these, you just have to be able to identify what the causal relationship is. So, if you were doing an expert witness, I don't do expert witness work, but if I were, I would say, and we're talking about, I don't know, HIV. I'm hardly an expert on it. Let's just say that I would be a medical witness. I would have to identify that it's necessary but not a sufficient cause. Because HIV will develop, you need HIV to develop AIDS, but you don't necessarily develop AIDS from HIV. I just need to identify that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So that's involved you looking at other factors.
Yes.
To be able to drive that.
That's right, that's right. You have to be able to look at the factors. And this is a way of further classifying and further analyzing your relationships that you're trying to establish.
So the reason why I asked the question is during my internship we did incident investigation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we did it to determine if the employee needs would qualify for workers' compensation. And the way the decisions were being made, I was not so sure about how they came up with their fast conclusion to say, oh, this is not work related, this is work related, right? So like the carpal tunnel syndrome you were talking about, we have a lot of some employees complain about that. But how do we really know, or how do we really know it didn't start from the workplace? You know,
That is a classic problem with carpal tunnel syndrome because, like I said, the causal relationship is, you can go down the causal list. Women tend to be more susceptible to carpal tunnel syndrome. So, but it's neither necessary nor sufficient. Not all women develop carpal tunnel syndrome, and you don't need to be female to develop carpal tunnel syndrome because men can develop it too.
yeah.
Repetition, well, it depends on anatomical configuration of your wrist of the carpal tunnel. Also depends, so that's genetic largely, or your conditioning. There are some people that have conditioned, that are so well conditioned that they, despite any risk factors that they might have, they're still not going to develop carpal tunnel syndrome because they're in good condition. And so that's another factor to look at. There are, you have to look at, and the reason that women are more susceptible is because of hormonal variations, monthly basis and also based on pregnancy. That's because that causes an increase in edema in the carpal tunnel, which increases your risk factor for developing carpal tunnel syndrome. So to establish, you would have to have a very, without doubt, establish a relationship between carpal tunnel syndrome and the workplace. And I'm not sure that this is the way that they should approach it, but they would have to interview them about their non-work activities. Because if somebody ties flies at home as a hobby, if somebody knits or crochets as a hobby, any fine work that you do at home increases your repetitions and increases your risk factors. What they should probably look at is say, is this activity sufficient, or is it likely to cause carpal tunnel syndrome? And if they have a lot of hand motion, I think eventually, if I were advising them, I'd say you would be far better with employee relations and to go ahead and pay a workman's compensation case unless you know that someone is malingering, because unfortunately there's a lot of malingering, which is why most employers are so reluctant to pay carpal tunnel syndrome claims because of the multiple factors. That was one of the reasons why we don't have a carpal or an ergonomic standard, is because it's very difficult to establish the work-relatedness of most musculoskeletal disorders. But if you do an activity that is hand-intensive, just for employee relation concerns, I think most employers would be better off paying it. Because, and like I said, separating out the malingerers, it's better to err on the side of a lax criterion, like in signal detection. It's a signal detection scenario too, because you're never going to perfectly separate out the actual work-relatedness from the non-work-relatedness. What you have to decide is where you're going to set your criterion and what you can benefit from where you're going to set it.
Okay. Other factors they look at is, did we aggravate it? If this a pre-existing condition, right? Did did our work process help aggravate that effect? So
did they do pre-screening before they employ people?
I suggest that.
Yeah, but then there's no way to establish that. There's no way that they can, unless they can get a lawyer to subpoena somebody's medical records, there's no way they can say that they're aggravating an existing condition. All I can say is that this is a factor, this is a task that could cause carpal tunnel syndrome or aggravated if it already exists. But they can't say it's aggravated something because unless the employee voluntarily presents them with a medical examination or a nerve conduction velocity test or something that says, I have had this, it was better, I started doing your damn job and now I'm worse. Okay, but that would be the employee's responsibility to do that. The employers can't do that. That was a little bit of a diversion, but I hope interesting. Anybody else have any questions or anything? All right, well, that's all I have for today. I'll see you at 3 o'clock next Tuesday. Or in the interim, if you have any questions or anything. Hey, thanks guys.
Thanks, Max.